and this is not to be facetious, but I really, I often argue that I discovered a new species. They're called academics, and they're defined by being invertebrate castrati.
Yeah.
Invertebrate because they have no spine, and castrati because they don't have any testicles, right? And it's really regrettable, because you would think, as a tenured professor, there is an institutional mechanism that protects you precisely so that you can speak your mind, so that you can do the research that you...
It's quite literally the whole point of tenureship,
That's
right?
literally the whole point, right? I mean, you had Socrates, who was executed. You had Galileo, who was put under house arrest. We decided that we can't have academics not be able to engage in free thought. Therefore, we created a mechanism called tenure that says, I can't fire you unless you do ethical or moral or criminal breaches. I can never fire you for anything that you say or write. Well, that's great. So then why don't you speak?
I'm here with a man who I think needs no introduction at this point, at least to be on this show. He is an evolutionary scientist. He is an author. He is a professor. He is a rabble-rouser. Dare I say a bit of a Twitter troll? Can I say a teeny tiny?
If it demands it.
Bit of a Twitter troll. My old friend Gad Saad, the first ever
That's true.
guest on the Rubin Report. This
you.
is probably your dozen, maybe 12,
Something
14,
like
15th appearance on the show. It's also, this is the first time we've done this setup.
Gorgeous.
What do you think? We thought we'd do something a little friendlier,
Gorgeous
not
setup.
so oppositional.
And you are looking trim.
Should we start there? You also have lost a bunch of weight, my friend.
I have.
Yeah. You're out there kicking the soccer balls, playing basketball. We're going to shoot some hoops later.
I didn't bring any attire, but we'll see what happens.
We'll get you out there. But you are trim, and that fits with your last book, which is all about happiness. Apparently taking care of yourself has something to do with that.
Indeed. You know, the psychological weight of having young children and not putting all the odds in my favor. My physician kept saying the blood pressure is starting to inch up. You need to lose weight. And there's nothing better than having young children, and you want to be around for them as long as possible. So when COVID came around, I thought, let's turn this really draconian negative into a positive. Stopped eating, started training, and lost tons of weight.
I feel you, man, because you just met the 220-month-olds out there, and I got a couple of years that I need to stay in shape. So anyway, we could talk about our physiques all day long, but let's talk about things going on in the world. At first, why don't we start where I usually start with you when I have you in studio, which is we've been doing this a long time now. I mean, that first interview we did was 2015, 9 years ago. It feels like many lifetimes ago for me. Do you feel that somehow all of the things that you and I and a bunch of other people were talking about, Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson, and everyone knows the list, that did we somehow miss the mark? Because the world has seemingly gotten worse in the 9 years.
It's so frustrating, right? Because, I mean, to go back to the earlier point about health, imagine if you go see your physician and he or she keeps warning you, screaming from top of the mountain, you've got to do X, Y, Z, and you just keep ignoring it, and then bad things happen. That's exactly what's happened with the ecosystem that we operate in, which is many of us have been standing on top of the mountain, some of us in the media, some of us in academia, some of us in both, saying, guys, this is what's coming down the pipeline, and yet people don't want to hear it. And now,
do you think we did anything wrong? Do you think there was a way, or is the guy who yells from the top of the mountain, is he always ignored? That's sort of repetitive in human history.
So I've been recently talking about the idea that there is unfortunately, a poor design of the architecture of the human mind, whereby you ignore things unless it comes and hits you exactly in your home, right? So take someone like Bill Ackman, whom I really respect, and I love what he's doing. But Bill Ackman only woke up when it hit his alma mater, hit, Jewish-related issues. But had he, been awake to many of these things, maybe he could have entered the fray a bit earlier. And so
for people that don't know him real quick, he's basically a tech guy, billionaire tech guy, very influential. He's built some great products and sort of woke up after October 7th. Although, did you happen to see that just a 4 or 5 days ago, he had retweeted a video of Ron DeSantis saying that there never was a Palestinian state and why you should call it Judea and Samaria and not the West Bank and a bunch of other truths. He retweeted it and then deleted it when he got pushback. So he's still not there yet. And, and I say that with the same sort of respect that you're referring to.
Yeah, you always want to encourage people. I mean, you don't want to go to people and hammer them and say, hey, you're coming too late to the game. You still want to encourage people, better late than never. But it is frustrating because, look, the problem will eventually get solved, but it can either get solved with a lot less violence, a lot less cost, or it can get solved later down the line with more cost. Kind of like you catch the cancer early or you catch it when it's metastasized and it's stage 4.
But evolutionarily,
right,
do we just always wait till it's too bad? I mean, what are societies that were heading off the cliff that didn't? Is there evidence that groups just don't do the worst thing possible?
I mean,
over time?
It depends. I mean, there is something called the negativity bias, which would argue against what we're discussing, which is we tend to pay more attention to negative information than we tend to pay equivalent and symmetric on the positive side, precisely because ignoring positive information doesn't loom, evolutionarily speaking, as big as ignoring negative information. And so you would think, according to the negativity bias, everybody should be attuned to these things. But I think it's too scary. And hence, that's why in the parasitic mind, if you might remember in chapter 6, I have a whole chapter on ostrich parasitic syndrome. And here again, even though the ostrich doesn't literally bury its head in the sand, the metaphor is very apt because it describes the natural default value of people, which is bury my head in the sand and hopefully, cross fingers, the problem will go away. It doesn't.
So are you seeing now, maybe since October 7th, and then also relative to what's going on with our borders and a whole bunch of other stuff, that maybe a few more ostriches are at least peeking out of the sand every now and again? It seems like they're getting there. That's sort of what you're referring to with Ackman. But the question is how to complete the hero's journey with them.
So yes, and even in academia, I'm starting to see a growing number of academics very gently pulling their head out of the sand, but not at a speed that I would like them to, right? So, the monster is coming at you at 100 miles per hour and you're autocorrecting at 2 miles an hour. It's not a fast enough autocorrection. So yes, there is some optimistic signals out there, but not fast enough.
Has the academic layer of all of this been the most shocking part of it to you, that so many of the academics that you work with, and I want to talk about Concordia specifically because you've got a serious headache on your hands over there, but that so many professors who are tenured and should not only be teaching the right things, I'm sort of past that point, let's say they're going to teach the wrong things, but at least still be able to stand up for some basic principles that we thought they believed in, that they have checked out too.
Yeah, so and this is not to be facetious, but I really I often argue that I discovered a new species. They're called academics, and they're defined by being invertebrate castrati. Invertebrate because they have no spine, and castrati because they don't have any testicles, right? And it's really regrettable because you would think, as a tenured professor, there is an institutional mechanism that protects you precisely so that you can speak your mind, so that you can do the research that you...
It's quite literally the whole point of tenureship,
That's literally the whole point, right? You had Socrates who was executed. You had Galileo who was put under house arrest. We decided that we can't have academics not be able to engage in free thought. Therefore, we created a mechanism called tenure that says, I can't fire you unless you do ethical or moral or criminal breaches. I can never fire you for anything that you say or write. Well, that's great. So then why don't you speak? But what ends up happening is that most academics, first, they're extremely cowardly, perhaps in part because there is a self-selection bias against what I call intellectual Navy SEALs, right? I mean, Navy SEALs, you do pick them because they have to be brawny, they have to be courageous, they have to be athletic. In academia, we might pick people who are smart, but they're not intellectual honey badgers. They're quite timid, they're tepid, they weren't the jocks. I mean, I'm being a bit maybe hyperbolic, but they lack that combative nature.
But are you surprised that was across the board in our institutions? That it does, like, now there are some universities that are a little bit better, or at least aiming that way, Ralston College and University of Austin, but that virtually everybody in the Ivy League chose the timid one instead of going.
It doesn't surprise me because I've existed in that ecosystem my whole life, right? So when I go to departmental meetings, we usually have committees to decide on striking a task force to study the feasibility of having coffee in the faculty lounge.
Yeah.
So it'll take us 5 years of feasibility studies before we decide to have a $30 coffee machine. So
How's the coffee?
Not very good. So, you know, it's it moves slowly. It's glacial speed. It's very, you know, there's a lot of niceness. So people don't speak directly. So even if I want to disagree with you, I will preface it by saying, I hear your point. I hear you. There's kind of this infantilizing that takes place. And I'm a direct speaker. And so it's very, very difficult for me to, in a sense, exist in that ecosystem because it goes against my most fundamental disposition.
If you're looking for smarter conversations about academia, check out our academia playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.